The wind came first, not the gentle hush of passing seasons, but a howling, low-throat grief that shook the eaves of Sophie May Whitlock's cabin. It moaned through the chinks in the timber walls like an old man mourning his youth, and she listened to it from her place by the hearth, hands wrapped around a cup of bitter corrie. There was no tea left. Hadn't been for 3 winters. Sugar neither. But there was salt, enough of it in her bones to last another 5 years. Outside, the world had turned white again. Snow crept like moss across the windows, thickening in slow motion flurries, blurring what little horizon her land offered. The fields were already buried, the fence posts gone under, the barn's roof bowed beneath the weight. In that silence, you could almost believe the earth had died. And sometimes Sophie hoped it had. Once she'd loved storms back when Henry was alive and they'd race to shutter the windows together, their laughter echoing through the cabin like it belonged. Back when they'd nestle under wool blankets with their baby tucked between them, telling stories while wind screamed outside like wolves denied. That was 5 years ago. Fever took the baby first, then Henry, then the neighbors with their gossip, then hope. She still wore her wedding dress on Christmas. It hung from her shoulders like surrender. Too loose, too gray. The lace yellowed with time and fire soot. On ordinary days, she wore men's work shirts and heavy skirts patched to the knees, boots cracked and resoled with rawhide. Her hair, once curled and pinned, now hung blunt and uneven around her jaw, hacked with dull scissors when the world stopped deserving ceremony. That evening she moved like a ghost through her own home, chopping wood with numb fingers, pouring water from the barrel, still unthawed near the hearth, feeding the stove as if it could warm her soul. The silence in the cabin was old. It had a scent, wood smoke, vinegar, old wool, and quiet despair. And yet, something about this storm was different. The air inside her lungs felt watchful. She thought more than once that this might be her last winter, not from lack of food, though that too was dwindling, but from the slow erasure of purpose. There came a point when even breath felt optional, when waking up felt like disobedience. Some nights she spoke to the snow, asked it why it hadn't finished what it started, asked it if it was waiting for something or someone. She didn't expect an answer. But just past dusk, one came. The knock was soft, then louder, then rhythmic. 7 distinct raps, each more certain than the last. Not frantic, not pleading, not even cold, just deliberate, like a man introducing himself to fate. Sophie froze, fingers half buried in the flour sack, eyes darting toward the door as if it might open itself. No one knocked here. Not for years. The last person who had was a deputy looking for a runaway boy. She'd sent him away with bread and a lie. She stepped slowly toward the door, her mind racing in quiet pulses. Bandits, drunks, ghosts. Her hand trembled as it touched the iron latch. She took one breath, then another, and opened the door. They stood like shadows against the white. 7 men, each taller than the door frame, thick with furs, feathers, leather, and snow. Comanche. That was her first thought. The bone chokers, the braids, the eyes that did not flinch from hers. One stepped forward. Broad shoulders, snow melting on his cheekbones, a scar across his chin. He removed his hood. "We seek shelter," he said simply. His voice was deep low, like the storm itself had learned to speak, only for the night. Sophie blinked. Her heart had begun to race, quiet, but real. She looked past him. They were not armed visibly. No threats, no hunger in their expressions, just weariness. The man waited. The storm howled behind them, picking at their cloaks like a starving dog. She stepped aside. Inside the air changed. Their presence shifted the heat, the balance, the silence. They removed their boots at the threshold without being asked. One rubbed warmth into his hands. Another crouched by the stove like a prayer. No one spoke. They carried the quiet with them, but not the kind that crushed. It was the kind that listens. Sophie lit another lamp and placed it near the hearth. Her hands shook as she ladled stew into bowls. What was left of the root cellar? The largest of them, the scarred one, stepped forward and took a bowl gently. "Thanks," he murmured. No other word, she nodded. They ate slow like men who knew what hunger could do. She noticed one braiding his hair again, his fingers nimble despite the cold. Another sat cross-legged, carving something from bone. A third cleaned his hands with snow and lard. They were not raiders. At least not now. They were travelers, men carrying miles in their bones. Her eyes kept returning to the scarred one. There was something in his face. Not softness exactly, but clarity. He did not watch her with hunger. He watched her like a man who'd known silence and saw it mirrored in another. She hadn't spoken in hours, but now she did. "There's space in the loft," she said. "And blankets." He nodded. "We sleep on floors." The others were already rolling their furs near the hearth. They moved like a unit. No orders, just intuition. Men who had shared winters, wars, and worse. Sophie went to the loft anyway. She brought down the good quilts, the ones Henry's mother had sewn before she turned cold. She placed one over each man after they slept, barely breathing like a mother tending strangers. When she reached the scarred one, she paused. His eyes were closed, but his hand reached out, gently closing over hers. It wasn't a grab. It was a promise, that he was real, that he saw her. She pulled back, heart thudding like it had just remembered how. She did not sleep. The wind screamed louder that night. Branches snapped outside. Snow covered the windows entirely. But inside the fire burned bright. 7 strangers and 1 woman kept it alive, not with words, but with presence. In the morning, the scarred one stayed behind while the others went out to chop more wood than she'd ever seen a man gather. He said nothing. But when she brought him tea, her last herb steeped in hot water, he offered her a small stone carving in return. Smooth, round, shaped like a hawk. She took it in both hands like it might break. Their fingers brushed again. She wanted to ask him why he stayed, why he carved that, why he looked at her like he'd seen her before somewhere in another life. But she said nothing, and he smiled. That evening, Sophie sat alone in her rocker, the carving in her lap, staring into the fire like it might answer all the questions her heart was too shy to ask. Outside, the storm began to die. But inside her, something else had begun to stir. Something old and aching and impossibly warm, and just before sleep claimed her, she heard the wind shift. Not away, but towards something. Towards someone. Sophie awoke before the sun, long before. A pale grey light hovered beyond the frost-laced windows, and the stove crackled with the last breath of coals. Her breath plummeted before her lips as she sat up in the rocker, still dressed from the night before. A quilt draped across her lap like a memory she hadn't meant to hold onto. For a moment, she wasn't sure if it had all happened. The knock, the men, the way silence had turned warm instead of sharp. But then she heard it. The steady rhythm of someone splitting wood just beyond the barn. Not frenzied or careless, measured, intentional, like a man who didn't want to owe anyone anything. She stood slowly, stiff from sleep, and pulled her shawl tight. The air bit her skin even inside. The moment her boots hit the floor, they creaked. Below the loft, one of the men stirred, rolling over in his sleep. Another coughed quietly, then fell still again. When she opened the door, the wind caught her breath. Snow stretched out in all directions, waist deep in some places, drifted high around the fence line, and there, half shadowed by the barn's lean-to, he stood, the scarred one. He was shirtless despite the cold steam rising off his body like heat from a forge. His long black hair was pulled back in a leather tie and his arms swung the axe with smooth efficiency. A fresh stack of firewood piled behind him. He hadn't done this to show off. He did it because it needed to be done. She didn't call out, just watched. Until without turning, he said, "Morning." His voice was lower now, quieter than last night. It vibrated in the air between them like the first deep note of a cello. She stepped forward a little, chin tucked against the cold. "You'll freeze." "No," he said, driving the axe down. Cold sharpens the edge. It keeps a man honest. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't try. Instead, she went back inside and warmed what little porridge remained, adding a pinch of dried apples she'd hidden from herself for weeks. When the men woke, they moved without chaos. They folded their furs, shook out their boots, and waited silently for bowls. Names still hadn't been shared. That silence didn't feel wrong. It felt respectful, like each word had weight and needed earning. The scarred one sat apart from the others, but near her kitchen counter. When she handed him his bowl, their fingers brushed again. He didn't flinch this time. Neither did she. After breakfast, they went to work without being asked. 3 reinforced the barn wall where the storm had split a timber. 2 others shoveled a path from the house to the creek. 1 repaired the sagging chicken coop gate with a length of rawhide and the scarred one. He returned to the axe. Always the axe. Sophie didn't understand it. Why men like them, Comanche, feared by every settler within a 100 miles, were here, treating her home like sacred ground, like something worth mending, and more than that, why she felt safer than she had in years. By noon, the wind had slowed, the sky breaking into patches of dull silver. One of the men, older, his hair streaked with gray, sat beside her porch, carving a length of bone with a slow, rhythmic motion. He didn't speak English. Or perhaps he just chose not to. But when their eyes met, he nodded as if saying, "We see you and we mean no harm." She tried to imagine what her neighbors would say. A woman like her, alone, housing warriors in her kitchen, warming their bodies with her stove. She could already hear the whispers. "She's lost her mind." Or worse, that sharp echo of judgment pressed against the glass of her memory like a handprint. They judged her after Henry died, too. Said she didn't cry right. Said she didn't bury him fast enough. Said maybe God had turned his back. But none of those people had lifted a finger when her roof sagged or her baby burned with fever. Only offered prayers when what she needed was presence. That evening, one of the younger men, no older than 25, laid down a carved piece of driftwood by her fire. It was shaped like a buffalo's head, rough but strong, a gift. He nodded once, solemn, and returned to his place on the floor. Sophie's throat tightened. Later, as the fire danced and the shadows grew longer, the scarred one approached her table. In the lamplight, she saw his eyes clearly for the first time, gray, not cold, but worn, like stones smoothed by years of rivers. His face bore the weight of stories he hadn't told. "You're not afraid," he said. "I was," she answered honestly. "But not now." "Why?" she hesitated. "Because none of you have taken anything you didn't ask for." A pause. "Then we're not what they say." She met his gaze. "Neither am I." Silence swelled again, but it was soft now. Comfortable, like 2 souls listening for the same distant sound. "Your name?" she asked. 2. The word settled in her chest like a puzzle piece she hadn't realized was missing. She offered her own. "Sophie May." To repeat it at once, quietly, as if tasting it, "Sophie." There was something reverent in the way he said it, almost like a prayer left unsaid for too long. That night, as the wind picked up again and the sky threatened another round of snow, the men laid out their furs in the same quiet order. But Toto stayed near the door, his back to it, as if keeping watch, not for danger, for her. Sophie watched from the stairs. For the first time in years, she didn't dread the darkness. It felt like a blanket now, not a trap. She went to her room, closing the door gently behind her, sat at the edge of the bed, hands in her lap. She could feel the carved hawkstone in her apron pocket, warmed by her body. She had always thought that loneliness was a kind of death you lived through. But maybe it was something else, a waiting, a hollow waiting for someone who wouldn't ask her to fill the silence, only to share it. She turned down her lamp and stared at the ceiling, her breath steady. Tomorrow the snow might melt, or it might rise again. The men might leave or stay longer. But something had already shifted inside her. Something too quiet to name, too sacred to rush. And then, just as sleep was pulling her under, there came another knock. Not at the door this time, at her window. A single knock. Then silence. She rose slowly, heart rising with her. She pulled back the curtain and there he stood. Not with urgency, not with hunger, but with a calm, wordless question in his eyes. And Sophie, she didn't say a word. She simply opened the window. The first thaw came quietly. A single drip from the eave, then another. The snow began to slump along the roof's edge, like shoulders loosening after a long grief. Days had passed since the 7 Comanche men arrived. Now only one remained. Tu had not explained why he stayed. He simply hadn't left. Sophie didn't ask. Each morning she found something mended, hinges repaired with leather, logs stacked precisely by size, the fence line reset where the storm had bent it. He worked without instruction. He slept near the hearth, always rising before her. Sometimes she wondered if he slept at all. Their words were few, but the silence between them softened. They moved like two people who'd once been strangers, but now shared something raw. Not romance. Not yet, something older, like recognition. One afternoon, while she stirred the stew pot, Tojo stepped in from the cold, tracking snow in without apology. He carried a rabbit in one hand, already skinned, laid it on the table without a word. Sophie turned, wiped her hands on her apron, and met his eyes. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, then added, "You were running low." She hadn't told him that. He'd noticed. Later, as the rabbit simmered in the room filled with a faint smell of thyme and meat, she set 2 bowls on the table, one at her place and one across. A simple act, but it felt like lighting a lantern in a long, dark room. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he walked to the shelf above the hearth, where a line of yellowed books gathered dust. He picked one up, Walden, worn at the spine, and turned it in his hands. "You read?" he asked. "Used to." Her voice sounded smaller than she meant. "Still do," he said. "You just forgot." She didn't argue that night. They ate in near silence. But when she set her spoon down, he spoke again. "You braid your hair different now." She blinked, touched the side of her head without thinking. Her hair had been falling into her eyes, so she pulled it back in a loose twist. "I haven't had reason to care about that," she said, trying to laugh. "You have reason now." His words dropped gently, like snow against glass. She looked at him and for once didn't look away, but something inside her pulled back, not out of fear, out of shame. She wasn't ready for what he might mean or what she might want. The next morning, Sophie avoided him. She scrubbed the wash basin harder than it needed, gathered kindling with stiff arms, busy herself with anything that kept her eyes down. She caught glimpses of him outside, repairing the chicken coop, wiping frost from the window panes, tying a rope between the barn and the porch to guide them during storms. He didn't ask why she kept her distance. That night, she found a bundle of cured jerky left on the table. No note, just his care, laid down quietly like a bridge she hadn't dared cross. Still, she didn't cross it. 3 more days passed. On the 4th, Sophie slipped while hauling a bucket of water from the creek. Her boot caught a hidden patch of ice and her hip struck the frozen ground with a sickening crunch. The bucket spilled. Her breath vanished. She lay still for a long moment, eyes wide, unable to even cry out. The sky above her was pale and distant. The snow beside her smelled of bark and earth and something older, like time folding in on itself. And then he was there. Tu appeared in silence, knelt beside her like the wind itself had guided him. His hands, warm and steady, slipped beneath her shoulders. "You fell," he said softly. She tried to nod. Couldn't. Without asking, he lifted her. His arms cradled her like she weighed nothing. But it was the gentleness that undid her. The way his cheek brushed hers as he adjusted his hold. The way he shielded her face from the wind with his shoulder. Inside he laid her down by the fire, removed her boots, pulled a quilt over her legs. Then he disappeared. She closed her eyes. The pain throbbed dull and pulsing, not just in her hip, in places much older. When he returned, he brought warm water and willow bark. He touched her only where necessary, brief, careful, never lingering. His fingers were calloused, but reverent. "You need to rest," he murmured. "I'll take care of the rest." And he did. She watched half drowsy as he moved through her home like he belonged, tending to the stove, feeding the chickens, even rinsing the spilled laundry she'd left in the basin. No ceremony, no pride, just presence. That night, Sophie didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought of his hands. Not the strength in them, but the restraint. When dawn broke, she rose slowly and walked into the kitchen. Her hips still ached, but she moved. She chose to move. She found him near the barn feeding the horses. He turned at her approach. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." He studied her a moment, then nodded. "You should be careful," he said gently. "The snow still hides teeth." She smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was true. He stepped closer, hesitated, then reached up so slowly, and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. "You're strong," he said. "No," she whispered. He tilted his head. "You think strong means loud?" She didn't know how to answer that. Later that day, she found her mirror. It was tucked behind a drawer, long forgotten. When she held it up, she barely recognized the woman inside. Her cheeks were fuller, her eyes steadier, her hair, still unruly, was tied back in a braid, clean and tight. She set the mirror down and laughed under her breath, then cried quietly without shame. That evening, she wore her burgundy scarf, the one she'd hidden in the trunk after Henry died. Tu said nothing when he saw it, but his gaze softened, and something unspoken passed between them. They ate together again, their fingers brushed. This time, neither pulled away. When he stood to stoke the fire, she found herself watching the way he moved. How careful he was with her things. How nothing about him demanded space, but everything about him earned it. "Why did you stay?" she asked suddenly. He paused. The fire popped behind him. "You didn't ask me to leave," he said. It was a simple answer, but it filled the room like a hymn. That night, as she climbed the ladder to the loft, she stopped halfway, looked down. He looked up from his blanket. "Will you keep the fire going tonight?" He nodded, and she slept soundly for the first time in years. But come morning, there were fresh boot prints in the snow. Not his. They led to the barn and then back into the woods. 3 sets. Not 2, not 1, 3. Sophie had always believed her heart was not built for winter. Not this kind of winter, the long, starving kind that outlives the woodpile and presses on the soul like a cold stone. She'd grown used to pretending the ache was weather. But now something deeper was moving beneath her ribs. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but motion, and it frightened her. Tojo had returned from the treen with 3 rabbits and a frown carved into his face like bark. He hadn't spoken of the tracks in the snow, but Sophie saw it in his eyes. Something had shifted. The quiet in him wasn't just habit anymore. It was caution. That evening, he didn't sit at the table. He stood near the window, sharpening his knife in slow, deliberate strokes. The sound was rhythmic, almost soothing, like an old lullaby cut from stone. Sophie stirred stew in the pot, her fingers trembling more than they had last week. She could feel something winding tight between them. Not resentment, not distance, something watchful. "They were watching the barn," he said without turning. "Didn't come close, but they were there." Sophie didn't ask who they were. In the West, it was enough to know someone was near. Someone with nothing good in their pockets. "I thought no one came this far," she said. He paused. "Most don't. But these men, they were not lost." She set the spoon down gently, her appetite curling in on itself. After supper, he insisted on checking the perimeter. She tried to stop him, offering to light more lanterns to bring the chickens inside, but he shook his head. "Lanterns are signals," he murmured. "Let darkness be your shield." Sophie stood on the porch while he vanished into the trees, snow crackling beneath his boots like dried bones. The cold sliced at her cheeks, but she didn't go inside. She watched the woods, the outlines, the absence, until finally he returned, face wind-burnt and expression unreadable. 2 miles out, 3 men, whiskey and arrogance, he said. Drifters. Locals. That word dropped between them like a stone in shallow water. Locals meant judgment. Locals meant whispers that turned into torches if you didn't watch your back. That night, Tojo moved his sleeping furs near the door. He carved another hawk. This one rougher, almost angry in its shape. Sophie didn't ask why. She simply brought him a cup of warm cider, the last of it, and set it down beside him without speaking. He didn't thank her. He only looked at her hand as it withdrew and said softly, "You shouldn't have to live like this." She paused in the glow of the fire, unsure what to do with that tenderness. "It's how I've lived for years," she said. "Years don't mean truth," he replied. Sophie returned to her chair, wrapping her shawl around herself as if it might hold her together. She didn't sleep much. The snow fell again, muffling the world. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote yelped and was answered by silence. The next morning, Sophie collapsed. She'd risen early to break ice from the trough, a task her body remembered, even if her muscles begged for mercy. The cold bit into her hip as she leaned over the edge, and her breath caught wrong. Her knees buckled. The ground met her before she could even call out. When she opened her eyes, the sky was spinning. Tu was beside her almost instantly. He carried her inside without asking, without speaking. His hands were gentler than snow. He set her by the fire, wrapped in furs, then boiled willow bark until the air smelled bitter and medicinal. "You're not eating enough," he said. She didn't argue. Couldn't. He crushed the herbs, pressed a cloth to her side, and knelt beside her for hours. Once she opened her eyes to find him sleeping upright, arms folded, knife still at his side. Not for protection, just for readiness. When she finally sat up on her own, the cabin had changed. Everything was cleaner, more ordered. The floor swept, the windows cleared. A braid of sweet grass now hung near the door. "You did all this," she murmured. He looked up from the stool where he was sharpening arrows. "You are not a burden," he said without blinking. Her throat tightened. Later that day, Sophie stood before the mirror again. Her hair had come undone, falling in soft curls she'd long forgotten she had. Her face, pale and bruised, still held color. Her hands no longer shook. She pulled on her oldest dress, not out of shame, but memory. It still fit, and somehow it felt like armor. She stepped outside to find Tojo skinning a rabbit on the porch. The snow had lightened to a soft drizzle of flakes, each one delicate and slow, like time had decided to walk beside them instead of ahead. "You saved me," she said. "I stayed," he answered. It was the same thing. She sat beside him and helped with the rabbit, her fingers clumsy but determined. They worked in silence, the kind that feels like conversation. That night, she made stew with care. She added dried sage and a single sliver of apple for sweetness. Tu ate slowly, as if tasting her effort. After dinner, he unrolled a fur blanket and motioned toward the hearth. "I'll stay by the fire tonight," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "You can stay," she whispered. "Where you always stay." His eyes held hers. Then he nodded. That night, she slept with his breathing in rhythm behind her. Not touching, just presence. It was the safest she had ever felt. At dawn, Sophie found a note carved into wood. Simple, sharp. "They're coming back." Her breath caught. She stepped outside, the cold slicing again. The tracks were fresh. Men on horseback. 3 of them. They had circled the barn. Come close. Looked inside. She found Tojo by the creek, standing still, hand on the hilt of his blade. They know I'm here now, he said. What will they do? They will test. He looked at her, not with fear, but with resolve. Sophie touched his arm. You don't have to stay. His jaw tensed. I do. Back at the cabin, Sophie loaded the stove with extra logs. She set 3 candles in the windows, not as a welcome, but a warning. She took down Henry's old rifle, though it hadn't fired in years. It felt wrong in her hands now. When Tojo returned, he brought a satchel of supplies and a look in his eyes she hadn't seen before. We can run, she offered. No, they'll find us. He looked at her gently. This place is yours. It's the first good I've seen in a long time. She looked at him. And you? I was never meant to survive either, he said. But you gave me fire again. She stepped forward slowly until she could feel his breath. I don't want to lose this, she said. You won't, he promised. Then he turned toward the barn and Sophie, heart pounding, watched the trees because someone was already moving through them. Sophie watched from the porch, shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, breath curling in small ghosts. The sky had gone Peter gray, the kind that warned of more than weather. The wind didn't moan like it used to. It whispered, now, a warning. Tu stood near the barn, eyes scanning the tree like he could read the future in the sway of the pines. He hadn't spoken much since the tracks reappeared. 3 riders, same as before. But this time, they hadn't just circled. They dismounted. They'd looked. He hadn't told Sophie exactly what he saw out there. But something in his posture had changed. Less patience, more storm. She'd seen it once before when a coyote had crept too close to the hen house. The silence before movement. That was Toto's way. Stillness that gathered like thunder. He came back from the barn with the same rhythm as always. Measured steps, a glance toward the wood pile, a quick check on the horses. But today he wore his blade visible. His eyes didn't soften when they landed on her. They stayed sharp, fixed on something far beyond her shoulders. They'll come today, he said. How do you know? Because they've waited long enough. Because men like that don't walk away from what they think they're owed. Sophie gripped the porch rail. Her fingers looked older in this light. Worn, scarred, but steady. They think I'm something to take, she said, not asking. He nodded once. And they'll see I'm not something to let go. She exhaled slowly. There was no bravado in his voice. No pride, just certainty that he would stand between her and harm, even if it meant breaking something inside himself to do it. By midday, the silence cracked. Hooves crunching through snow. Not rushed, not panicked, confident. The kind of rhythm that said, we've already decided what happens next. Tu was already outside. Sophie stayed near the door, rifle in hand. Though it felt like a lie in her arms, she hadn't fired it in years. The rust smelled of ghosts. 3 men emerged from the trees. Local. She recognized one, Cal Dorsey, broad-shouldered and mean-eyed, the kind who never said a full sentence without cursing something weaker. He rode up slow, grinning like a man who thought he'd already won. Well, Cal said, dismounting. Ain't this a picture? Little prairie widow with a red man guarding her doorstep. Thou said nothing. The second man, wiry with a busted lip, chuckled. Heard you was playing house, Sophie. Word travels even in storms. She stepped forward now, rifle raised, but not pointed. You got no business here. Oh, we got business, Cal said. You just don't like the terms. This here's still white land. You taking in Comanche like a husband makes folks nervous. He's not my husband, Sophie said quickly, then regretted it. To move, didn't blink. Cal's smile widened. So, he's just living here. Sleeping in your bed, eating your food, chopping your wood like a tame dog. That it? The insult didn't land where it was meant to flinch, but something in his jaw shifted. His fingers curled slightly at his sides. A flicker. Then the third man, young, flushed, hands twitching on the res, stepped forward, shotgun loosely cradled in his arm. We just want a word. Just a little conversation. To finally spoke, one step closer, and you'll have more than words. The silence that followed was deep enough to hear a bird shift its weight on a distant branch. Cal's smile turned. Not fear, anger. He stepped forward. You threatening us? I'm promising you. It happened fast. The third man raised his shotgun. Twitchy and stupid. Sophie screamed, the sound catching in the cold air like glass breaking. To moved, not with rage, not with sound. Like lightning carved into a man's shape. He crossed the snow and drove his shoulder into the shooter's chest before the gun could fire. They fell hard, snow exploding around them. The weapon clattered across the ground. A shout rose, Cal grabbing for his revolver. Sophie raised her rifle. Her arms shook, but she fired. The bullet missed, striking the tree beside Cal's head. He flinched just enough. Two was up again, dragging the third man by the collar, hurling him into a drift. His knife flashed now, drawn in one clean motion. The second man lunged with a knife of his own, but Tojo was already turning, already inside the arc of the swing. Steel met flesh, a scream. The second man fell to his knees, blood pouring from his thigh, not fatal, but enough to end the fight. Cal stood alone now, gun in hand, face pale. He looked at Tojo, at Sophie, at the mess of snow and blood, and whatever false courage he'd carried into this place dissolved into the wind. Go, Toto said. You walk out, or you stay and get buried. Cal hesitated, then backed away. His boots made no sound now. Just retreat. He left the others. They could crawl or not. He didn't care. When the trees swallowed him, Tojo finally looked back at Sophie. Her rifle was lowered. Her breath ragged. You were right, she whispered. They came. He walked to her slowly, blood on his hand, not his own. She touched his wrist. He didn't stop her. I'm not ashamed, she said, voice trembling. Of you, of this. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, something broke inside him. Not hardness, restraint. The way a man breaks when he realizes the thing he's been protecting no longer needs protecting. It just needs him. I would have died for you, he said. You lived for me, she answered. He leaned his forehead to hers. The wind howled again, but it was different now. Not threat, release. Later, after they tied the injured men to their horses and pointed them down the trail, Sophie found Tojo cleaning his blade by the stream. The blood washed away easy. The storm inside him did not. You've seen worse, she said. Yes, but you never wanted to bring it here. No. She stood beside him, hands folded. Then let's not let it stay. He looked at her, eyes steady. Well, rebuild the fence tomorrow. Well, rebuild everything, she said. He nodded, and for the first time, he smiled, truly smiled, like the man he might have been before the storms came. Behind them.